It is known, but less understood, that Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy. In Dr. George G.M. James's highly recommended and legendary book, Stolen Legacy, he painstakingly argued this point. Being an expert and professor of logic and Greek, paired with his personal experience of Freemasonic mystery school teachings, he was able to view and understand the underlying interconnections in a true and revolutionary way. Welcome to Shaman Vision. According to Google quote, the ancient Greeks practically invented Western culture. So many aspects of our modern lives are owed to things first created over 2,000 years ago, end quote. Today, we will be destroying this myth and exploring the reality of the ancient Egyptian influence on Greek philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and theology. Let's get into some primary sources. Homer, born 8th century BC, was a Greek poet who is credited as the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, two epic poems that are foundational works of ancient Greek literature. Homer is considered one of the most revered and influential authors in history. He is quoted saying about Egypt in his book, The Odyssey, quote, "Every man is a healer there, more skilled than any other man on earth. Egyptians, born of the healing god himself," end quote. Herodotus, known as the father of history, has this to say about the Egyptian in his book of the Histories, quote, "Moreover, the naming of almost all the gods have come to Hellas or Greece from Egypt." He goes on to say, "It is true also that the Egyptians were the first of men who made solemn assemblies and processions and approaches to the temples. And from them, the Hellenes, or the Greeks, have learnt them. And my evidence for this is that the Egyptian celebrations of these have been held from a very ancient time, whereas the Hellenic were introduced but lately," end quote. So here we have clear evidence of Homer describing the Egyptians as more skilled than any other man on earth, and Herodotus admitting that their gods' names came from Egypt and that some of their ceremonies have ancient Egyptian origins. Let's keep going. Socrates is a Greek philosopher from Athens who is credited as the founder of Western philosophy. He never wrote anything down. His teachings were purely in dialogue. But his student Plato writes in his book, Phaedrus, that Socrates says in dialogue with Phaedr, quote, "At the Egyptian city of Naucratis, there was a famous old god, whose name was Thought. The bird, which is called the ibis, is sacred to him, and he is the inventor of many arts, such as arithmetic, calculation, geometry, astronomy, droughts, and dice. But his great discovery was the use of letters," end quote. It is not known for sure if Socrates visited Egypt or not. Our only source for him are his teachings from his students, Plato being the most predominant one. So if we're going to agree that Plato, in his writing in Phaedrus, represents his teacher in a fairly accurate way, we see that Socrates expounds the view that the Egyptian god Thought, and in turn the Egyptians invented arithmetic, calculation, geometry, astronomy, writing, and more. To continue, his student Plato, born 428 BC, who we know spent a significant time in Egypt, writes in his book Timenius, a story about a man named Solon's time in Egypt. He is quoted saying, quote, "When he was questioning the priests that were most versed in ancient lore about their early history, he discovered that neither he himself nor any other Greek knew anything at all." At this point, one of the priests, a very old man, said, O Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is not such thing as an old Greek." And on hearing this, Solon asked, "What do you mean by saying this?" The priest replied, "You are young in soul, every one of you, for you possess not a single belief that is ancient and derived from old tradition, nor is your understanding gray with age." The wise Egyptian priest goes on to tell Solon the history of his own people in Athens. How fascinating is that? We must remember, these aren't Egyptian writings. These are Greek writings about Egypt, expressing their adoration for Egyptians and recognizing them as old and wise people who they are eager to learn from. How come you don't hear about this in your college civics or Western civilization class? We're not done yet. Socrates, born 436 BC, was an ancient Greek rhetorician, among the most influential Greek rhetoricians of his time. He is quoted saying in his work Mysterious, quote, "Egyptians are the healthiest and most long life among men. And then for the soul, they introduce philosophy training, a pursuit which has the power not only to establish laws, but to investigate the nature of the universe." End quote. Here, we have another influential Greek figure admitting and saying clearly that the Egyptians already had a fully developed understanding of philosophy and law before Greek philosophy was ever established. Who are we crediting with the invention of philosophy again? Mathematics. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy says this about the philosopher Thales, born in 620 BC. Quote, "Geometry originated in Egypt where it developed out of necessity. It was then adopted by Thales, who had visited Egypt, and was introduced into Greece by him." End quote. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, wrote that, quote, "Thales was a disciple of the Egyptians," end quote. Last, but certainly not least, Pythagoras. I will give some special attention to Pythagoras due to his accredited theorem and his interesting life. We all learned about him in school, but did we know, according to DiscoveryMagazine.com, quote, "Pythagoras left no writings, but he did found a sect, or what some would deem a cult, the Divine Brotherhood of Pythagoras. Its followers are often referred to as simply Pythagoreans, a secret society dedicated to a combination of scientific and mystical precepts." University of St. Andrews website Math History says, quote, "In about 535 BC, Pythagoras went to Egypt." They go on to say, "The accounts of Pythagoras' time in Egypt suggest that he visited many of the temples and took part in many discussions with the priests. Pythagoras was refused admission to all the temples except one at Diospolis, where he was accepted into the priesthood after completing rites necessary for admission. It is not difficult to relate many of Pythagoras' beliefs, ones he would later impose on the society he set up in Italy, to the customs that he came across in Egypt. For example, the secrecy of the Egyptian priest, the refusal to eat beans, the refusal to wear even clothes made from animal skins, and their striving for purity were all customs that Pythagoras would later adopt." End quote. From this, we can see that it is known, but seldomly talked about, that Pythagoras didn't invent much. He went to Egypt, worked very hard to join a mystery school, studied Egyptian mathematics. He then packaged these mysteries and mathematics up and brought them into Greece and began to teach. I believe it's disingenuous to teach about Pythagoras without bringing up these critical points. Even NASA admits on their own government website, quote, "Pythagoras, for whom the theorem is named, lived in ancient Greece 2,500 years ago. It is believed that he learned the theorem during his studies in Egypt. The Egyptians probably knew of the relationship for thousands of years before Pythagoras." Do you guys see a common theme here? There seems to be an obvious thread connecting all the most influential Greek thinkers. And that thread is, they're not Greek thinkers at all. They're Egyptian thinkers, teaching in Greece. They traveled to Egypt, recognized as the place of wisdom. They then learn there and bring that information back to their people. And that is a noble deed. They make no qualms about their stays in Egypt. They openly admit it. It's only after the Europeans relearned this information from the Muslim scholars who were the custodians of this knowledge that you see the disconnection from ancient Egypt. I wonder why that is. Another clear case of borrowing, and I might dare say stealing, is from the famous Aristotle. He is known as an ancient Greek philosopher and polymath. His writings cover a broad range of subjects, including physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, drama, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, meteorology, geology, and government. That's a lot of subjects to specialize in. Let's find out how that came to be. We will refer back to Dr. George G.M. James and his monumental work Stolen Legacy, which inspired this video. I highly recommend this book if you're interested in the origins of Freemasonry, ancient mysteries, philosophy, theology, mathematics, and ancient Egypt in general. In interest of time, I will be paraphrasing his main points. Please refer to the full book for more detail. The link is in the description. He starts off by saying, "The Greeks were banned from learning in the Egyptian mystery schools for a long time. Due to outside invasions, restrictions loosened up, and some outsiders that were deemed worthy were allowed in to study the ancient mysteries, most learning directly from the Egyptian priests themselves. After the invasion by Alexander the Great, the royal libraries were looted, plundered, and eventually compiled in the Library of Alexandria. It is here, Aristotle studied the sacred text and began to take notes. These notes then developed into his quote-unquote books. This copying of the already ancient text explains how he can be accredited with writing a physically impossible number of books on such a wide array of subjects. The history of Aristotle seems to be very ambiguous and leaves out key details. And for this reason, Dr. George G.M. James is very skeptical of its accuracy. He goes on to say that Aristotle was supposed to have spent 20 years studying under Plato, who was a philosopher. Yet all of Aristotle's work is done on the sciences. Dr. George G.M. James then asked the question, how could Plato teach Aristotle what he himself did not know? He then goes on to expose some holes in the false history of Aristotle. He claims in order to avoid suspicion over the vast number of books ascribed to Aristotle, history teaches us that Alexander the Great gave him a large amount of money to get the books. And if that's the case, in order to purchase the books on science, they must have already been written. And if the books were written before Aristotle bought them, and since it's claimed he never visited Egypt, then the books in question must have come from Greek philosophers. If the books came from Greek philosophers, then we would expect the knowledge of these books to have been known before Aristotle's time. And therefore, he could not be credited either with producing the books or introducing new ideas into science. Dr. George G.M. James goes on to say Aristotle died in 322 BC, not too long after Alexander the Great secured the largest quantity of scientific books from the royal libraries and temples of Egypt. In spite of amassing this intellectual treasure, the death of Aristotle marked the death of philosophy among the Greeks, who evidently didn't have the natural ability to advance these sciences. Furthermore, he states, quote, every schoolboy believes that when he hears or reads the command, know thyself, he is hearing or reading words which were uttered by Socrates. But the truth is that the Egyptian temples carried inscriptions on the outside addressed to the neophytes, and among them was the injunction, know thyself. Socrates copied these words from the Egyptian temples and was not the author. All mystery temples inside and outside of Egypt carried such inscriptions, just like the weekly bulletins of our modern churches, end quote. Another point of interest he brings up is the attitude of the Athenian government towards this so-called Greek philosophy, which they regard as foreign in origin and treated it accordingly. History shows us that Greek philosophers were undesirable citizens who were consistent victims of persecution by the Athenian government. Anaxagoras was imprisoned and exiled. Socrates was executed. Plato was sold into slavery, and Aristotle was indicted and exiled. Pythagoras, the earliest of them all, was expelled from Croton, Italy. How is it the Greeks take credit for teachings that they openly persecuted and rejected? He ends this section by saying, quote, certainly they knew they were usurping what they had never produced. And as we enter step by step into our study, the greater do we discover the evidence which leads us to the conclusion that Greek philosophers were not the authors of Greek philosophy, but the Egyptian priest. Now we understand that it is known, but seldom acknowledged, that Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy. It's time we all meet back together at the source. The days of misinformation, propaganda, and lying in history are done. It's 2023 now, and the truth will be revealed, and the truth will set us free. I would like to give a major shout out to Dr. George G.M. James, who died mysteriously soon after releasing this book in 1956, as well as Dr. John Hendrick Clark, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Wesley Muhammad, and Dr. Martin Brunell. Links to books and sources are in the description. Thanks for watching. Peace.